Good evening. Tonight we're going to be continuing with Genesis, and we have finished the stories of Jacob, or we have finished what we're going to talk about for the stories of Jacob, and now we're going to move on to the final section of Genesis, which can be thought of in 4 parts, which is the primeval saga from chapters 1 through 11, the stories of Abraham from chapters 12 through 25, the stories of Jacob from 25 through 36, and now the stories of Joseph, chapters 37 through 50. A brief recap of last week, we looked at Genesis 31 through 33, which I have deemed the conclusion to the main body of stories of Jacob. And so Jacob's stories were concentrated on the strife that he experienced with his brother Esau in the first place, and secondly with his father-in-law Laban, father-in-law and uncle. And so we looked at the conclusion to those strifes in chapters 31 through 33. So we looked at how Jacob was delivered, in essence, from Laban by being able to escape with his family and with all his wealth that he had acquired by God's blessing. Laban had chased after him, and Laban claimed that he could have harmed Jacob. He could have done whatever he wished to him, but he wouldn't, because God had intervened and told Laban not to do so. And so God had delivered Jacob from that threat. And then, as soon as that one's over, he's coming back to the land, and now he has a new threat, or rather, in this case, actually the older threat of his brother, his murderous brother Esau, who's in the land he's thinking of as waiting for him, as Esau had sworn before to kill him when their father died. And so we see that God delivered him from that as well. But before he meets Esau, he experiences 2 revelations. One is he sees the angels of God at Mahanaim, and then he wrestles with a divine being, perhaps God himself, right before he meets Esau. And so his name is changed to Israel because Jacob has striven with both God and human beings, and he has prevailed. And so we talked about this striving that the people of God are perhaps even called to do. We're called to strive, not in a contentious sense, not in a harmful sense, but in this sense of striving for the blessing, striving with God, striving with humans. And in the end, God will protect and bless us. And right after that, we see God does exactly that for Jacob when he meets Esau, and Esau welcomes him with open arms. And so they're reconciled. But then Jacob deceives Esau one last time when he says that he's going to follow him to Edom, to Seir, but instead Jacob goes to Canaan. And so the split is made official. They officially part ways, they're reconciled, but they will no longer have anything to deal with each other, at least they themselves, because later on their descendants will embody the Jacob and Esau's strife between the nations. So now what that brings us to is Jacob's generation is now passing, and we're going to look at his children. Before we do so, let's say a prayer. Our God and Father, we ask you, Lord, for your guidance, your protection, and your blessing upon us, your people. We pray that this study tonight is in truth, is in all sincerity and honesty, and that your Spirit be with us to instruct us, Lord, in your teachings. Please teach us, Father. Please shape us and transform us into the image of your only Son, Jesus Christ. It is in his name that we ask you these things. Amen. And so now what we're going to be looking at as I'd already mentioned, is chapters 37 through 50. And so in this, we see that we're going to look at Jacob's children now and the stories that goes on between them. And so his independent stories have come to a close, and now we're looking at the next generation. Now, we've already seen some stories about Jacob's children. In chapter 34, we didn't discuss this ourselves, but in chapter 34, Simeon and Levi go on this violent massacre, and they kill all the men of the city of Shechem because of Dinah, because Shechem had taken Dinah, their sister, by force. And so Simeon and Levi go and massacre them all. And then at the end of chapter 34, Jacob rebukes them for having done so. He said, "You have made me odious in the eyes of the natives of the land now. Now we're in danger because of what you have done." And then in 35:22, a single verse, we see another comment about one of Jacob's children, which is Reuben. It simply states that Reuben slept with his father's concubine Bilhah, and that Israel found out about it, that being Jacob. And that's all it has to say. So this is a very short, very intrusive, abrupt statement. It doesn't seem to really fit at all. It just seems like the story is, the narrator is going on, and then all of a sudden stops, puts it in there, and then continues with the rest of the story. So the fact that it's inserted means that it's important. And so when a man sleeps with his father's concubines, that's an act of rebellion. And so we saw exactly that happen later on with Absalom and David. When Absalom drives David out, he has relations with all of David's concubines as an act of rebellion, as an act of usurping his father's place. And so we see Reuben essentially doing that here. And so these two accounts, these two little snippets, will be alluded to again in Genesis 49, when Jacob declares his blessings or declares the fate of his children on his deathbed. Jacob mentions this. He says that Simeon and Levi are hotheads that you shouldn't be associated with. And essentially, Reuben will become insignificant. And so this is because their descendants, Simeon and Levi, those two tribes, they end up not having any land. Simeon is absorbed by Judah, and Levi never had land in the first place. And so, in a sense, these two acts are kind of reflective of what the tribes will be like later on. And then secondly, Reuben, on the east side of the Jordan, essentially vanishes into nothingness. It never becomes of anything. And so these two acts had severe consequences that lasted for hundreds of years. And then they were the first three born sons, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. And so what that does is that essentially knocks them out and sets the stage for the fourth son, which is Judah. And we see exactly that happen. And so even in these stories that we're going to look at, chapters 37 through 50, Judah will come to the fore at key moments. He's going to be one of them. Reuben will as well, but we're looking at Judah because Judah will become the ancestor of the dynasty of Israel and Judah. Okay. And so now, before we get into chapter 37 specifically, one more thing I want to summarize about this section. In 37 through 50, it's been noted by many commentators. This section is very different from the rest of Genesis. First of all, it has a very well-developed theme. It's very cohesive. It has this finely tuned plot, a beginning, a middle, it has several climaxes, and then it has this nice conclusion. And so it can be read as a single, almost uninterrupted story. And so this is very different from the previous sections in that it seemed to be just a combination of random stories put together. But the Joseph story seems to be very cohesive and united. Secondly, This section has almost no appearances made by God. If you recall from the past, God, especially the first 11 chapters, he's the main one who acts the entire time almost. And then in the story of Abraham, he appears to Abraham over and over and over again and speaks to him directly. Same thing with the story of Jacob, not as much as Abraham, but God does appear multiple times. In this last section, God rarely, if at all, directly appears to people and speaks directly to them. So it's an interesting thing to note as we go through these stories. And then lastly, the promises that have dominated the patriarchal stories so far, since chapter 12, kind of recedes into the background. It's not really mentioned explicitly at all. The promises of descendants and land. And part of the reason for this is that these promises have already been delivered to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they are the ones to whom the promises have come. And now what we're doing, now that those promises have been delivered and they've started to come to fruition already, now we're honing in on the family, the promised ones themselves. So despite these differences, there are also several similarities. It continues many of the themes that we found in the rest of Genesis. First of all, there's favoritism. And we'll see that plays a key role, especially at the beginning. There's brotherly strife. That is a huge theme in this last section. There's deception. And perhaps most importantly, God's providential care in the face of danger continues to bless and protect the family of Israel, the people of God. And so this section, by the end of Genesis, in this section, it'll resolve some of the tensions that have built up throughout Genesis, especially this brotherly antagonism and strife and deception and this separation and brokenness. That will be partly resolved. But at the same time, by the end of Genesis, we don't even come close to the promises being ultimately fulfilled. The stage is just being set. And so, as we go through these final chapters, we want to keep these things in mind. Think about the themes, the continuity, the discontinuity, and how it's still incomplete even when we finish it. Okay, now let's look at chapter 37, which is the beginning of this final section. So now verses 1 through 4 is the exposition. It's the beginning, the intro that sets the stage for the rest of the story. And so what we see here at the beginning is that it says that Jacob is dwelling in the land of Canaan. This corresponds to the very end in chapter 47, where it says Jacob will settle in the land of Egypt. And so they're kind of two opposing halves. And so what this tells us is that these chapters are a story about the transition from Jacob in Canaan to Israel in Egypt. And so we're going to see how this family moves from this promised land of Canaan and ends up in Egypt, which will be the site, which will be the setting of the next major story of the Exodus. And so part of the story is telling us how Jacob came to be Israel in Egypt. But that is not the sole purpose, or even, I don't even think it's the main purpose of this story of Joseph. So let's start looking at that. Now, at the beginning, there are two reasons given for why Joseph's brothers hate him. First of all, it says that he speaks ill of them. He brings back bad reports about them to their father. Okay, that's one thing. So people would, maybe they'd consider him a tattletale or a rat or a snitch or something of the sort. It doesn't say whether these are true or not. It doesn't say whether Joseph is lying about it or whether Joseph is just telling his father what they're really doing. It doesn't give us any of that. All it tells us is that Joseph brought bad reports and his brothers hated him for it. Sorry, it doesn't say that's the reason why they hated him, but that sets the stage for it. And then secondly, and more importantly, it says that their father loved Joseph more than the rest of his sons. And so again, we see this favoritism come back in the life of Jacob. He experienced it from his father Isaac, except he was on the wrong side, the wrong end of it. He wasn't favored. It was his brother Esau. He favored his wife Rachel, which caused antagonism there. And now he's doing it again in favoring his son Joseph, his second youngest son Joseph. And the reason it says that he loved him more than the rest is because he was the son of his old age, meaning he had him while he was old. Well, what kind of reason is that to favor one son above the rest? Again, there may be some cultural backgrounds or reasons to why having a son in your old age meant you loved them more. I'm not sure on that point, but in any case, the reason he loved Rachel might have been because she was beautiful. It seemed fickle, and maybe this is a fickle reason as well. In any case, there is this favoritism that is about to perpetuate the strife, the hatred, and the destruction within the family. And so this love, not only that, but this love that Jacob has for Joseph is exemplified by this gift, this ornate robe. It's been called a coat of many colors. We're not exactly sure what this means. Some translate it a long-sleeved robe. But in any case, we know that this is a special gift. It's ornate. It's probably beautiful. It's probably very well made, something of these sorts. And he gives it to Joseph, and it seems to Joseph alone. And so that, in essence, symbolizes the favoritism and love that Jacob has for Joseph above the rest of the brothers. And so we're going to see this symbol is going to come back later on in this chapter. And so this ornate robe is used also in 2 Samuel chapter 13, when it's talking about how the daughters of the king would wear this. It uses the same expression for this robe, the same words. So this seems to have some royal connotations, possibly. And so maybe what this is doing is that it's foreshadowing Joseph's future position. How he is now wearing this prized royal robe above the rest of his brothers. And so we're going to see this come to fruition later on. And so that just sets the stage. He brings bad reports, and their father loves him more than the rest, symbolized by this beautiful, ornate, royal robe. And now what we come to is actual narrative. That sets the stage, and now we're going to look at two dreams that Joseph has back to back in our narrative. And this is the third reason that's basically the cherry on top for why his brothers hate him. And the story explicitly says, Joseph told them a dream that he had, and they hated him even more because of it. So in this first dream, he tells them that they're all binding sheaves in the field, all 12 of them, it seems. And his sheaf of grain, stands up, and the rest of them circle around it and bow down to his sheaf. The 11 sheaves. So all 11 of his brothers come and bow down to him. And they respond with incredulity. They are upset. And they say, "Are you to reign over us? Are you to rule over us?" So they give these two back-to-back statements like, are you serious? And so they are looking at this as a reflection of Joseph's attitude. They're looking at this as, who do you think you are that you're going to rule over us? So not only in their eyes, not only is Joseph talking bad about them to their father, not only does their father love him more than the rest, and it's obvious, but now they think that Joseph is putting himself up on this pedestal, essentially saying that I'm better than you all and you will all serve me. And so that just adds another layer to why they hate Joseph even more. But then comes the second dream, and this second dream doesn't stop with just the brothers. It extends it even to Joseph's parents. And so this is about the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. And this time, it's not Joseph's brothers who respond angrily, it's Jacob himself. Jacob says, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? And so, and then his brothers are even more, they become jealous of him. That's what it says. And so this is serious. It's important to know why they're so upset. Because to us, dreams are just like, oh, that's a weird dream, or that was funny, when we tell each other the things we've dreamed about at night. But to them, it was a little more serious because dreams often meant something. As we're about to see, these dreams actually did as well. And so perhaps they can't stand the thought of having to serve their younger brother. And even the parents serving their child, that is not a notion that is acceptable at that time. That's preposterous. Parents serving their child. But we're going to see throughout this story that exactly that thing happens. Joseph does indeed rule over them. And so this is reminiscent of what God had told to to Rebekah earlier before. When God told Rebekah that he's talking about the two children in her womb, he says, the younger shall serve the older. And so we see this as well when Noah talks about his sons. He says, may God enlarge, or he talks about how may Shem rule over Canaan, the son of Ham. May he rule over his brothers. So there's this theme of the one brother ruling over the others, usually the younger. And so we see that with Joseph, that's going to happen. The younger is going to rule over the older ones. Not only that, he's even going to have rule over his own parents. Okay, and so that has set the stage. That sets the stage for the relationships that exist between Joseph and his brothers and even his parents, or Jacob. Okay, and so now that brings us to the next part of this story, the final part of this chapter, which is much longer, verses 12 through 36. And so we find that on another occasion, Jacob sends Joseph to go check on the brothers. And he says, bring me back information about how they're doing. And so a question comes to mind, well, why wasn't Joseph with them in the first place? So maybe this was another act of favoritism. We don't know for sure. It doesn't say. But it makes you wonder, if Joseph was a shepherd with his brothers, why wasn't he with them while they were in Shechem, shepherding the flocks? And not only that, but Jacob is expressly telling Joseph to bring back information about them, which may be kind of the channel for why he would bring back bad reports. Again, we're not certain. It doesn't say, but it's possible. And so when he finally reaches them, they conspire to kill him. Specifically, they have in mind because of his dreams. That seems to be the main thing on their minds, because they said, here comes this dreamer, and then they say, we'll kill him, and we'll dip his blood, his coat in blood, and then we'll say that a wild animal devoured him, and we shall see what comes of his dreams. And so they have been driven to the point of murderous intentions. And so this theme comes back, and it seems like we're going to come full circle to the original brotherly pair where one murdered the other out of jealousy, out of envy. And so the stage is set. Now, murder again among brothers is about to take place, and we're going to come full swing. But then something happens. As they're about to murder their own brother, two of them step forward at different times. Two of them step forward, and they, through their actions, end up saving their brother from being murdered. The first is Reuben, as I briefly mentioned earlier. Reuben has the idea. He says, wait a sec. Let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in a pit. And the narrator tells us explicitly that Reuben did so because he wanted to save Joseph and bring him back to their father. So Reuben's intentions were indeed pure. And so but then after that, they sit down to a meal after they throw him in this pit. But first, notice they stripped him of his ornate robe. And so that's a symbolic act. That's an act against the idea that their father loves him more. They strip him of this robe and throw him in a pit. Then they sit down to a meal as if nothing really happened. They're like, okay, I'm hungry. Let's go eat now. And so maybe that shows their callousness toward their brother. But then secondly, Judah also has the idea of selling another idea. He says, let's sell Joseph instead of murdering him. So here it seems there seem to be two different strands, two different stories kind of going on here. One is Reuben tries to save Joseph by just throwing him in a pit. And then Judah has the idea of selling him instead of killing him. So there seem to be two different things going on here, and it's hard to reconcile the two, but we go along with it anyway. And so we're going to see Reuben and Judah come back later on when they have to bring Benjamin down to Egypt. Both of them, individually at separate times, step forward and tell Jacob, I will ensure that Benjamin is safe. And so these actions speak well of Reuben and Judah. But of course, we're going to focus on Judah because afterwards, nothing really comes of Reuben, but Judah becomes the father of the kings of Israel, the ancestor. And so the story is now coming to a close. Another thing to note is that we have two different groups that take Joseph and sell him in Egypt. And so this is another part that's hard to reconcile, almost impossible even, because it says that Judah wanted to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites who were coming down to Egypt. So Judah wanted to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, but then it says that the Midianites took Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. But then at the end of this chapter, it says the Midianites sold him in Egypt. So there seem to be two different things going on, and it's kind of confusing because it doesn't entirely make sense. But the main point here, is that both Reuben and Judah attempted to save Joseph, and actually did, because the brothers probably would have killed him. And secondly, Joseph is brought down by some group, Midianites, Ishmaelites, both, who knows, and he goes down to Egypt. So it's best not to get bogged down or worried about these details that don't always make sense, because that's not the point of the story. And so as the chapter comes to a close, Reuben goes back to the pit. He finds Joseph is gone because the Midianites had pulled him out and sold him. And Reuben wanted to restore Joseph to their father, and so he's He tears his clothes and he's so upset. He's like, what am I to do now? Showing his honest intentions. So then what they end up doing is exactly what they had planned at the beginning. They take the robe that they had stripped off of Joseph, they dip it in goat's blood, and then they send it to their father. They don't even go themselves. They don't take it to him themselves and they say, is this your son's? It actually says that they sent it ahead of them. It doesn't say who took it, but they sent it ahead of them with this message. Is this your son's? As if they wouldn't have recognized it themselves. This symbol, this token of Jacob's love for Joseph above the rest of his brothers act as if they don't recognize it. They're feigning this ignorance. Oh, I don't know who this is. Is this your son's? And secondly, they don't even use Joseph's name. And so remember, when you're reading biblical stories, pay attention to the wording. They don't say, is this Joseph's? They say, is this your son's? This intimate term, this relational term between Joseph and Jacob, symbolizing that love that Jacob has for his son. Is this your son? Obviously, everyone knows Jacob is thinking of Joseph, his favored one. And so Jacob comes to the conclusion himself. He doesn't even have to be told. He says the exact same thing his brothers wanted him to think. Jacob, his sons, wanted him to think. He says, Joseph has been torn by a wild beast and is no more. And so we see that the deceiver is deceived one final time by his own sons. As we've mentioned twice before now, Jacob deceived his own father with with goat skins, with the hair of a goat. And now we see that Jacob is deceived by his own sons by the blood of a goat. And so the fact that the same term, goat, they're slightly different. Different words are put in front of it, but the same word goat is used in both times. It's supposed to make us think of that reversal. Jacob is paying dearly for the deception that he had originally committed against his father. He pays it many times over. He's deceived by Laban multiple times, the biggest one being Rachel is switched with Leah, and now he's deceived by his sons. And so it says, Jacob enters this inconsolable, almost uncontrollable mourning for his son Joseph. It's excessive. He says, I will go down to Sheol mourning for my son. So he's essentially saying, I will never be comforted until the day I die. Again, this outburst is expressive of how dearly he loved Joseph. Meanwhile, as Jacob is weeping and mourning over his son, Joseph is being sold into Egypt by the Midianites. And so what we have is the stage is now set for the remainder of the story. Fratricide was prevented. Murder by brothers. That's what it was coming to. But then Reuben and Judah stepped in and they saved it. And so this theme is going to continue. It seemed like history was about to repeat itself and brother was going to murder brother. But then something came into the mix. Some brothers actually saved their brother. And so this is going to be part of the theme. This new reality of brothers looking out for each other. And so look for this theme as we go through the Jacob story. And it's going to show us how the people of God are supposed to live in relation to each other. But despite the fact that murder has been prevented, the situation is still dire. The family has been torn apart. One brother is sold into Egypt. Who knows what's going to happen to him? Who knows when he'll die? Who knows if anything will ever come of him? And the father is now mourning inconsolably for his son. And so this family is torn apart. And so what is to become of them now? So the stage is set for the remainder of the story. And so we'll continue with it next week. May God bless.